Hello, and welcome to the We Need Water podcast. My name is Michael Brent, and I'm the Water Resources Manager for Cascade Water Alliance in King County, Washington. Cascade is a municipal water supplier, providing drinking water to more than 380,000 residents. I'm glad you're here. I want you to truly care about water and make it your personal mission to become a steward of this incredible resource. Our topic today is climate change impacts and adaptation. We're going to discuss what that is and how it relates to our water resources. And our guest today is Guillaume Mauger with the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, which works to build climate resilience in the Pacific Northwest. Guillaume is a research scientist specializing in climate science. His work focuses on understanding and adapting to the impacts of climate change on flooding and stormwater in the Pacific Northwest. Guillaume has worked on projects that assess hydrologic changes across a variety of Northwest watersheds to apply climate information in habitat connectivity planning. And he has collaborated with floodplain managers to integrate climate change into their work. In addition to his research, Guillaume serves as a resource to stakeholders who are interested in obtaining and understanding the numerous climate and hydrologic projections that are now available. Welcome.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
How are you today? Very nice to have you. The UW Climate Impacts Group website states our expertise includes climate science, hydrology, conservation biology, forest ecology and management, climate impact and vulnerability assessment, adaptation planning, policy, governance, and community resilience. We use our expertise to help understand and address climate impacts and risk management across a range of sectors, including water, coasts and oceans, forests and fire, wildlife and ecosystems, and people in society. Well, that sounds pretty impressive. What does it mean?
All right. Well, we work on climate change adaptation, so helping communities and people, local governments, a variety of folks prepare and act in ways that increase their resilience in light of the impacts of climate change now and in the future. And so, we're another way of thinking about that is that we're a problem-oriented group, in where the problem is climate change and how can we prepare. And so, because we're focused on a problem rather than a specific discipline, we're by definition interdisciplinary, right? And so you were just listing off all those different disciplines. I mean, if you want to solve a problem, you can't just take one single narrow expertise to do that. There's often a lot of other things that come in. So, we have a hydrologist, we have climate scientists, we have a conservation biologist, sociologist, policy scientists, lots of different angles for looking at the same problem.
All right. Just in terms of definition, though, can you talk a little bit about mitigation versus adaptation?
Yeah, sure. So contrary to other, the lingo in other disciplines, for us, when we say mitigation, what we mean is reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases in there, or reducing the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so that we contrast that with adaptation, which is regardless of how much we emit and how much change we see as a result in the region, we're going to have to plan and prepare for. We're going to be impacted by climate change, and so we have to plan and prepare for it. So adaptation is that planning and that preparation. It's important, just like reducing. It's really important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce those impacts before they hit us. But neither is exclusive of the other. We got to do both. And we sort of split our world into those two camps. So other folks work on mitigation. That's super important. It's just not our expertise. We work on adaptation.
Right. It seems like there may be a paradigm shift that needs to occur there, because I think most of us at this point are kind of conditioned to understand that, yes, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to take these actions in our lives and across various sectors, but the idea of adapting to that maybe hasn't caught on quite so much yet. I guess I'm asking, is that a challenge for you, particularly if you're working with elected officials, jurisdictions, things like that?
I mean, generally, no. I don't think that we're spending a lot of time these days really debating whether or not climate change is happening and whether or not it's serious. That was a lot more of our time 10 or 15 years ago, and that's changed, and that's really a positive thing. Another positive is that it used to be that folks saw adaptation as a distraction from work on mitigation, a way of not working on mitigation. That's not the case anymore. Everybody recognizes that you have to do both and that both are important. Even if we could magically turn off the spigot today and stop emitting greenhouse gases, we would still see climate change and it would still be important, big compared to what we've seen so far in the last century. And that's because there's warming that's already in the pipeline, right, that we've already committed to, and it just hasn't caught up to us yet. That's not really a challenge, especially in this region, widespread recognition that climate change is important. It's here, and it's going to get worse, and there are potentially big ways that it could change, how we prioritize our work and what we focus on.
Right. Can you talk about how you assess the changes to hydrology? I know your field, you primarily deal with stormwater flooding impacts, things like that. How do you go about that process?
Yeah, I mean, so fundamentally, there's two we think of looking at climate change impacts, any climate change impact, in kind of two different ways, like a top-down way where we can sort of assess from modeling what we expect to happen, and a bottom-up way where we can think about, who's impacted or what habitat is impacted or what area and how those changes might affect them. And we kind of think of needing to do both of those at once, right? Because, it's one thing to know that things are changing. It's another thing to know how much they have to change to matter, or which changes are going to matter the most and where. And so you can't really assess the impacts in that top-down sense without also thinking bottom-up, what do we actually need to know? So that's one part of your answer. I mean, another piece, on a more technical side, a lot of that is understanding not just the climate science, right, about what are the climate changes that are projected for our region with modeling of various kinds, but also from the non-climate science aspects, what are the ways that the system that you're looking at, say like a water supply system or a particular species or habitat, that they are affected by climate change, and what do we know about what might happen with specific changes? So that's a very general answer. We can get into the details of the modeling if that's helpful, or not just modeling, observations and assessment. But that's kind of the big picture.
Right. Water resource managers are very concerned about snowpack. Much of our water supply in the Pacific Northwest comes from the winter snowpack, and we know there are going to be significant changes there, correct?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, snowpack is kind of the canary in the coal mine for a lot of areas. Not every place is affected, gets water from snowmelt. But a lot of places do, especially in the Northwest. We've got big mountains, glaciers, lots of snow. And there's a study recently, just a couple of years ago, that came out that looked backwards at what our observations say about how much snowpack we've lost. And they estimated that across the western U.S., since about 1950, we've already lost 15 to 30% of the snowpack we once had. So we're already dealing with a system that's totally different than it was, in the early 1900s. And I think we've already, what's interesting about that is, we know that there's shortages of water these days. We've seen California in the last decade. We don't. Probably it's been 2 or 3 generations since then. So we probably have sort of lost the collective memory of what the system was like and how things went when we had that snowpack that we've now lost. And then looking forward, that 15 to 30% is going to get bigger, right? It's the amount of warming we've seen in the last century is small compared to the amount of warming. It's like, 2 to 4 times less warming that we've seen in the past than we're expecting in the future. It's accelerating. And so that snowpack loss is going to accelerate. So that 15 to 30% is small compared to what we expect to see over the next few decades. and that's compounding and making the problem worse. The other thing I ought to mention about snowpack is that that is our, as many of you know, many folks know, that's our reservoir. We do have a lot of dams that hold back water that we use for water supply in the region, but they are small in terms of their capacity compared to the amount of water stored in snowpack. And so as that melts in spring and summer, that's a huge, important source of water that we're losing.
Most of those reservoirs, I think, are designed to be a one-season
Yep, that's right.
Catchment system.
Right.
They're drained down over the course of the fall and the winter, and then with snow melt, they refill. So if you miss out on even one season's worth of snowpack, that can really cause problems for you.
Yeah, I mean, the good news in the Pacific Northwest is, unlike California, every winter is a wet winter for us. I mean, there are drier winters and other winters, but we get a lot of water coming down in winter, and and that actually leads to a little bit of a false sense of security, because it turns out we have really dry summers. We don't get a lot of precipitation in summer, and so that's where it comes back to be an issue. But we don't have multi-year droughts like California for that reason, because you're always going to be following a dry summer with a wet winter.
Well, what are the predictions for summer rainfall? Have things changed significantly already?
So one of the really robust indicators of climate change is warming, right? It is called global warming after all. That's why snowpack is such a strong, is responding so strongly to climate change. It's because it's ultimately a warming signal. And, you just raise the snow line. I like to say that mountains are pointy on top. And so, we're losing a lot of snowpack initially. As you raise the snow line, you're losing a lot of area, a lot of real estate that used to have snow. Precipitation, is an indirect consequence of warming, the way it's affected. And on a seasonal basis, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what that looks like. So I'll come back to summer, but just to say, winter precipitation, for instance, if you look backwards at the records of observations, there's not a clear change over time. And if you look forwards, models tend to say a weak, like a small increase in winter precipitation, but not much compared to year-to-year variations. That is somewhat true also for summer, but there is more of a consensus among models, and also a tendency for a bigger change projected. So they're suggesting that it will get drier. There will be less precipitation in summer. As with precipitation in general, there's more uncertainty around that than warming, but there's a tendency towards drier summers. So at the same time as you have less snowmelt contributing to water supply, the models are also saying we're going to have less rainfall to make up that difference. So we're actually going to compound the problem with the rainfall change.
And that could spell even more problems for salmon, for example. The river systems are going to be warmer and have less water in them generally.
Yeah, so you have kind of a double whammy with water temperature. So already, fish, in order to have access to certain habitat, need a certain amount of flow. And that's, going down for the two reasons I was just mentioning, right? Less snowpack and less rainfall. There could be other factors. We think they're pretty minor, like you could have more evaporation, but we think they're mostly pretty minor. So it's really those two factors. But the other thing is, the big impact for salmon is water temperature, since they're a cold water fish. And what happens there is we both have less water in the river and we have warmer air temperatures because it's global warming, right? And so that's the double whammy, right? The water temperatures are increasing pretty rapidly, and that can lead to migration barriers, or even when it isn't lethal to fish, it can be unhealthy for them, impact growth rates, and so on and so forth.
I recently saw a news article about I think it's the Hinman Glacier in the Cascades, which used to be I think the largest glacier, one of the largest glaciers between Glacier Peak and Mount Rainier. And the article I saw said it's gone now, and that's in the Skykomish watershed.
Okay.
So, yeah. I guess, a fairly significant source of cold water during the summertime.
Right.
Going into that river system is now gone.
Yeah, glaciers are an interesting one because most snowmelt is peters out. There's not much snow left by the time you get into August, and actually even part of July. Um, so that annual snowmelt, setting aside the glaciers, isn't really helping with water supply in August. That's where we really rely on the reservoirs, but it's also where there's more important of a role for glaciers because they're called perennial, right? They last year in, year out. And so that melt coming off of glaciers can be important in some places because of the fact that it's there even when the rest of the snow is gone.
Do you think climate adaptation is being adequately built into planning and risk management strategies within most public agencies right now?
I think there's a lot. There's always more we can do, right? And I think I would say the flip side of that is the worst we can do is not do anything, right? I mean, there's always more we can do. I think there's a lot of really good work in the region. The Pacific Northwest is kind of an example to the nation in terms of climate adaptation work in many respects, and especially in the water supply world. The water supply, water management community was really an early adopter on climate change adaptation. It's been really an important part of the climate adaptation work nationwide and globally. Since the early 2000s, even in the late 90s, that was part of there were initial discussions. So really ahead of the curve in that respect. Some of the utilities in the region started up, for instance, the Water Utility Climate Alliance, which has put out a lot of resources that folks can use. So there's a lot of really good work. And at the same time, like we know with a lot of tough, complex problems, there's always more we can do. I mean, the impacts of climate change are dramatic, right? If you're talking about already having lost 15 to 30% of our snowpack and losing easily that much again or more in the next 80 years, that's going to dramatically change the way we do things, especially when you think that, we are already butting up against the limits of water availability in summer, right? So we can't really afford, without drastic changes, to lose more. So it's going to be a big challenge. There's always more we can do, but there's been a lot of good work in the region.
Mm-hmm. In terms of process, can you talk a little bit about how the research that your organization performs, how that gets to a point of implementation within the public sector? How does that actually work?
Right. So our role, as we see it, is to provide the information that supports action on climate change, right? And sometimes that looks like, more basic types of research, sort of more in the basic research kind of category of things. So, sort of in-depth modeling projects trying to assess future stream flow, or, I have a colleague, a conservation biologist, who just put out a paper looking at the future habitats that might, areas on the landscape that might be suitable habitat for grizzly bears if they're reintroduced, right? Just to give you a very different example.
Mm-hmm.
And other studies are much more tailored to specific questions, specific management questions, right? So, for instance, we recently developed an analysis of the study needs for floodplain management in Pierce County, right? So what other science do they need that is sort of currently limiting their ability to plan and, prioritize their actions? So a lot more applied, a lot more tailored to a specific management need. And so it runs the gamut between those two ends of the spectrum. But all the while, the underlying thread is that all of the research is motivated and also often conceived of in coordination and collaboration with the folks that would be using that information. So that's what we see and that's what, there's actually some good social science research backing this up, that the way, it sounds really obvious when you say it, but the best way to support action on climate change is to work with the people who are going to be taking those actions to understand what research they need, to develop that research in coordination with them in an ongoing kind of iterative process. And, in the academic community, folks refer to that as co-production or co-produced research. It sounds obvious, right? If you want to work with the folks that are doing something, if you want to help folks do something, you want to work with the folks who are doing it.
How do you go about identifying those folks?
Yeah, I think it's evolved over time, and it's always something that we're asking ourselves, actually, who should we be working with, and what new groups should we be looking at? Who have we not worked with? Who lacks the resources to have engaged with us? There's always that question. It's always something we're looking at. We want to make sure we don't have any major gaps in how we do this work. But I think the fundamental thing is that it takes time. It's a long-term investment of sort of mutual learning, and so. Like I mentioned, the water managers that were sort of early adopters on climate change, that was, it has been a decades-long collaboration. We still work with some of the folks that were originally working on that topic in the late 90s. And it continues to evolve, right? And so initially there's a lot of sort of learning to speak the same language, right? Understanding, mapping out issues. And that evolves into, folks in some cases doing their own research internally, some in coordination. There's a lot of back and forth over time.
You do much work with the tribes or other communities?
Yeah, the tribes have been kind of at the forefront of climate adaptation, also in the region and nationally. So occasionally, they've sort of asked us to work with them. One of my colleagues is currently leading a project that's engaging with tribes along the coasts of Oregon and Washington to better understand their concerns and interests and how to, develop a research program that might address those. And then there's been other projects along the way. Actually, that same colleague, her name is Meade Crosby, put together a climate change tool that's tailored for use by tribes in the region. So a variety of things, and I think we're always interested in hearing what folks are concerned about, tribes as well as other governments and organizations.
What does success look like for your organization?
Yeah, so I think an interesting thing that's different for us is, occasionally I'll get a message where somebody tells me that our results are being used by somebody else in a presentation or a report, sometimes not attributing that it's coming from us and that sort of thing. Whereas for a private company or maybe some other situation, that might be a problem. For us, that's actually what success looks like, is that our information is out there. Folks are using it. Working ourselves out of a job is actually a highly successful outcome for us, right? Because, one of the things, it's not just our information, right? We're often, one of the primary goals of a lot of our work is to sort of help build up the capacity region-wide to work on climate change, right? To where it becomes kind of like any other thing that folks manage in their jobs, right? And that isn't enumerated separately, right? Climate change right now, we think of it as like this thing that we need to do, right? But, a planner doesn't think about land use planning as a new thing they need to incorporate what they do, right? Or zoning, right? It's just embedded in their work, right? And that's what we want to get to, is where climate change is the same.
Very good. What can the average person do to better understand and promote climate adaptation?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. And I think the thing to remember is that nothing is too little, right? I think that I see a lot of a tendency to get overwhelmed with the amount of information that's out there, the amount of new concepts to learn about it. And it's great to learn new things. That's important. And also, we don't want to get into a place where we're paralyzed by the sort of fire hose of information that's out there and available, right? The more important thing is to try, taking action, try, engaging on the topic and learn as we go, right? We can always get more sophisticated with time, but it's better to do something than nothing at all. And so, like, to be specific, I mean, there's so many things, right? I mean, what's some examples? The city of Burien just ran a great climate change planning process. This is a town just south of Seattle that engaged a lot of local citizens, and it was great hearing them talk and involved and learning about climate change, as well as what thinking about what the policy and management implications were for the city. That's a great way. There's less involved ways of doing things. Just engaging with neighbors and talking and bringing up the topic is really valuable. And there's even things in the realm of your own backyard that can be done. And I think water is really central to climate change impact. So really anything that sort of helps with stormwater management or reducing water use, those are all really great climate change adaptations.
And what do you most enjoy about your work?
I really like, working on a topic that I know is really important with folks, who are interested in working on it and trying to think about solutions. I think it is a big, tough problem, and there are also lots of folks working on it, and it's exciting to see that. And there's lots of good opportunities and chances to learn and grow as we do it. So that's been fun.
Well, thank you, Guillaume. I appreciate your time.
No, thank you. It's nice talking with you.
Climate scientists tell us that no matter what we do, our climate will continue to warm for a long time. Of course, we need to do all we can to limit and reverse our carbon footprints, but I think it's equally important that we start thinking more about how we adapt to the changing climate in the coming decades. And I'm glad there are organizations like the UW Climate Impacts Group doing the hard work to help decision makers and communities better plan for the future. Thanks for being with me today. I hope you enjoyed this broadcast. If you did, please like and subscribe and follow us on the socials. You can also find helpful information about Cascade's water conservation programs at cascadewater.org. Have a great day, and remember, we need water.